Okay, thank you all very much for joining me. I'm going to be talking about why American kestrels are declining. So to outline the talk, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the Clifton Institute. Then I'll talk about kestrel basics, then home range size, vegetation structure and habitat selection, diet and prey abundance in different habitats, fledgling survival, migration, and finally land management recommendations. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge my co-PIs, Joe Kolowski at the Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation and Alan Williams. Both Joe and Alan have been involved in every aspect of this project, and Joe has led the data analysis. And last year's project team were Tom Beard, Daniel Margolis and Lane Smith, Kaylin Wolfer, Dan Hobson, Tucker Callahan, and Evan Kinnavan. And our other previous research technicians were Kristen Weil, Sophie Vasquez, Megan McDaniels, Megan Limo, Sarah Kane, Alex Shepard, and Sydney Jackson. And we have a bunch of other collaborators and volunteers and students who have played an important role in this project. And here, even more volunteers and collaborators. And it's just amazing, the number of people that have come together to work on this project. And I am so grateful for all of their work on this. And really, I'm mainly a spokesman. So the Clifton Institute, we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. We have 7 full-time staff, and we're funded by individual donations and foundation grants. Our 3 program areas are education, restoration, and research. And we're located about an hour west of Washington, D.C. in Fauquier County, Virginia. To briefly go over some of our other research projects, we are studying remnant grasslands in the Piedmont to understand what plants are found there and what their conservation status is, and also to come up with recommendations for seed mixes when people want to plant wildflower meadows so that they can do restoration as well as just planting pretty flowers. We're also working on box turtles, and we're especially interested in finding out when it's safe to mow your field so you can avoid killing box turtles. So we're tracking them. And we're also doing an experimental forest understory restoration project where we are comparing the effects of prescribed fire and deer exposures at restoring herbaceous wildflowers in the understory. And all of our research projects are inspired by questions that we've gotten from landowners that we don't have answers to. So I hope you see that these are very applied projects that we're working on. We also have a landowner outreach program. So Kadira Ingram is our landowner outreach associate. She meets with landowners and public lands managers, and she focuses on grasslands, but she also advises on a lot of other topics like invasive species control. And she has visited 300, she and Marie Norwood, her predecessor, have visited 300 landowners who manage 20,000 acres across the northern and central Piedmont. And if you're interested in receiving a free property visit, you can email Kadira, and there's her email address. Okay, so now onto kestrel basics. So American kestrels are North America's smallest falcon. They are predators of big open fields, and they're a charismatic species that get a lot of people interested in grassland conservation. Females are rufous and barred all over, whereas males have blue-gray wings and a rufous tail with a black band. And so kestrels are cavity nesters. They use natural cavities and more often nest boxes. They have a clutch size of 5 eggs. And here we can see 4 kestrel eggs and 1 starling egg. And kestrels usually only nest once per year. They incubate the eggs for about a month, and then they have babies in the box for a month, and then the fledglings are dependent on the adults for 2 weeks after they leave the box. The kestrel lifespan is around 3 years on average, with a record of up to 11 years. But unfortunately, kestrels are declining across the U.S. This is showing their annual decline. And in the Piedmont, which is this red area in between the mountains and the coastal plain from Alabama to New Jersey. They've declined by more than 70% since 1966. So it's a pretty serious issue. They're still common, but they are declining fast. And the jury is out on what the causes are of this decline. Like any threatened species, there are probably more than one factor that are contributing to the decline. And these are some of the hypotheses. So loss of agricultural land and urbanization, clean farming, so that's eliminating hedgerows, insecticides and rodenticides, predation by Cooper's hawks, competition with starlings, and low nestling or fledgling survival. These are all possible contributors, likely contributors to the decline. And so we've been tracking kestrels and studying them in the four major agricultural habitats in the mid-Atlantic. Those are fescue pastures, hayfields, row crops, and meadows. And meadows include wildflower meadows, native grass fields, and unmowed fescue fields. So the questions I'm going to be looking at for this talk are: how does home range size vary as a function of sex and season? How does vegetation structure affect habitat selection? What do kestrels feed their young in our area? How do habitat type and vegetation structure affect the abundance of kestrel prey? Is low fledgling survival responsible for the decline? And finally, where do our kestrels spend the winter? Okay, so that brings me to home range size. So like I said, we've been tracking kestrels for several years now, and the way we do this is we wait for the female to be incubating inside the nest box. We then plug the hole, go up and open the nest box and carefully remove her from the nest. We then attach a GPS transmitter on a backpack harness to her so that we're able to track. And we do this for males as well, but and we're showing a picture here of a female and a male. And the way it works is that when we are within about a quarter mile of the GPS transmitter, we're able to download the data and see where the kestrel has been. And so this technology has recently become available for kestrels. It's a really lightweight GPS transmitter. And it's designed, if you to work really well during the breeding season, so you can download the points when you're close to the bird. That works well when we know she's going to come back, he or she are going to come back to the nest box. It doesn't work as well for migration because the birds have to return to the same area for the breeding season. And so we weren't really hopeful for that, but we've ended up getting quite a few recoveries, as you'll see at the end of the talk. And overall, GPS technology is much better than the traditional radio tracking because we're able to get long distance movements and we get a lot more points. So this is a plot of all the tracking data that we've got. So we've tracked 69 birds, and the females are shown with orange circles and the males are shown with teal circles. You can see we started tracking in 2021, and we are tracking several birds now in April of 25. And here I'm highlighting Peaches. This is one of our longest running birds. So we've been tracking her for almost 4 years, and we have more than 11,000 points for her, which is an incredible data set. That's more locations than any other study of kestrels. And we now have more than 150,000 locations for kestrels. So we are really learning a lot about what habitats they prefer and where they're going. And together with our many partners and volunteers, we're monitoring more than 500 kestrel nest boxes in our region. And some of them are shown in the gray circles here. And the orange circles are showing nest boxes where we tagged and tracked a kestrel. So home range is one of the first things that we were interested in looking at. This is a fundamental life history trait of animals, and it describes how they use space. Calculating home ranges also allows us to estimate density and carrying capacity of a landscape. And maybe most interestingly, home range size is related to habitat quality. So if a bird has a small home range, that suggests that it's getting all its needs are being met in that small area, that suggests that it has that is high quality habitat. And that's really interesting to me as a conservationist. And so we are tracking kestrels throughout the year, starting with the incubation period when there are eggs in the box, moving to the nestling period when there are babies in the box, and to the fledgling period when the babies leave the box, then to the post-fledgling period when the adults are free and on their own. And then some of those adults then establish new territories during that period, and we call that post-fledgling shifted. And then finally, we're also tracking them in the winter. And this is what the home ranges look like during the breeding season. So this is the Clifton Institute, and each color is showing a different female. And you can see that they're packed in pretty tight, and there's not much overlap between those home ranges. And so this was our first look at the data. We tracked 13 females in 2021, and we found that they had a home range size of about 80 acres. And this is close to the smallest home range size that's been reported for the species. And we published these results in the Journal of Raptor Research in 2023. But now, and remember that we had 13 birds in that study. Now we have a much bigger data set, and so now I'm going to walk you through the whole season and also for males and for females. So here on the y-axis is the home range size in acres, and this is the incubation period for females. And so this is showing that females had a home range size of about 20 acres during the incubation period. They're spending most of their time inside the nest box. And then when we plot the home range size for females for the rest of the year, we see a slow increase. And by the time we get to winter, they're using about 100 acres per bird. So this is interesting. So we see a pretty big change from 20 acres during incubation up to 100 acres in the winter. And we also notice here are the sample sizes. So we have as many as 45 birds that we track during the nestling period. So we have a much bigger sample, and we're really confident now in these home range estimates. When we look at males, we see much bigger home ranges compared to the females. And so, not too surprising if the females do most of the incubation. So if she's in the nest box the whole time, then the male has to be out hunting to feed her. And that's what's happening. So the males have about 140 acre home range during incubation. And then during the nestling period, they get a much bigger home range of 300 acres. And this indicates that the males are out there hunting, and they're doing most of the providing of food for the nestlings in the box. And then we see that the home range drops significantly during the fledgling period, and this indicates that the female is doing more of the work feeding the fledglings, the babies that have left the box. But then we see that the male maintains a large home range for the rest of the year during the post-fledgling and winter periods. And what really jumps out to me here, obviously the difference between the male and the female, but there's a lot of change seasonally. And so this just shows you why it's important to use high resolution tracking of both sexes throughout the season. And to come up with a simple estimate of one home range for the whole year really obscures a lot of the important variation. But we still have to do it. So here it is. So the female, if you look at the entire year, the female has a home range of about 100 acres and the male of about 340 acres. So to summarize, males have bigger home ranges than females. Male home ranges shrink when females contribute more to feeding the young. And like I just said, the single estimate of a year-round home range is not that meaningful. And so like any good research project, we are starting to generate more questions than we have answers. Um, and just for example, we're showing two different kestrel pairs here. The top panel, the male and female are using a small home range, and they're both in the same area. And apparently their needs are being met in that site. In contrast to the lower panel, the male is covering a lot more ground, and the female is hanging around the nest box. And so, of course, we want to know why this is happening. So if you look at these images, it looks like maybe because there's a lot of forest in the southern example, but we need to figure out how habitat is related to home range size. And we also want to know how home range size is related to nest success. So now we have a lot of data on how many babies are being produced. We'd like to see how habitat is related to that, and also how big and also how home range size is related to that nest success. So our colleague and graduate student Kaylin Wolfer is working on these questions. She's doing a lot of analysis, and we're gonna learn those results pretty soon, which will be really exciting. That brings me to vegetation structure and habitat selection. So there's a lot of possible drivers of habitat selection in kestrels, things like proximity to the nest, human disturbance, available perches, and competition and predation risk. These are all potential drivers of how kestrels make their decisions on where they are going to hunt. But we are focusing right now on vegetation structure. So how tall and dense the vegetation is. And we're interested in that because that's going to affect the abundance of their prey. And it's also going to affect the detectability and accessibility of the prey. And so our technicians worked really hard in 2021 to collect data on vegetation structure. Here's Sarah Kane and Killen Wolfer measuring the height and density of vegetation. And now we're able to look at those results. So here on the y-axis is the use probability of kestrels, and on the x-axis is the vegetation height. And so we see that the kestrels really prefer to hunt in short vegetation. And by the time we get to the vegetation being a foot tall, kestrels are rarely using that. So just remember that. So if it gets to be a foot tall, that's pretty much inaccessible for kestrels. We also see that as the vegetation becomes more dense, kestrels are less likely to use it. And then if we look at the four major habitat types, hay, meadow, pasture, and row crop, we see that there's a lot of overlap. So there's not a clear winner in terms of habitat type as it relates to vegetation structure. That's true for vegetation height as well as for vegetation density. So to summarize, kestrels strongly prefer short fields. This is one of our most important results. Habitat is also important, and it varies throughout the year, but we don't have a clear answer yet on habitat. This is a complicated, really complicated analysis that Joe and colleagues are still working on. But it seems that meadows and pastures are preferred over row crops and hayfields, and we will get you those results as soon as we have them. Okay, that brings me to diet and prey abundance. So kestrels eat everything from ladybugs to young rabbits. And we looked through the literature and found that in terms of prey deliveries, these are items that are brought back to the nest box. Insects dominate, followed by small mammals, birds, and reptiles and amphibians. But there's a lot of variation. So one study in Pennsylvania found that about half of the prey were mammals. Another one in Texas found that about three-quarters of the prey were lizards. And one in Ontario found an unusually high proportion, 21% of the prey were birds. And so we're using two different data sources to characterize kestrel diet. We're looking at security cameras and nest box contents. So here's a kestrel nest box that has a little additional house on top, and that's where we keep the security camera that's keeping an eye on what's happening inside the box. And this is a motion activated camera that captures everything that happens in there. And so obviously we're going to get a lot of good information on the diet from this. The disadvantages to using these cameras is that they're expensive, about 250 bucks a piece. And it also takes a really long time to watch the videos, even if you speed them up. So labor intensive to get the data. And we're also looking at the all the junk that's left over in the nest box contents. And we're taking advantage of the fact that raptors are messy. They're not like neat and tidy passerines like bluebirds here, removing a fecal sac from the nest box. The kestrels are pooping in the box. They're leaving undigestible parts of insects and mammals and lizards. And that sounds like a gold mine of information to me. So few advantages of using this approach. First of all, we can actually identify the insects to species much more frequently with the contents than with the videos. And of course, it's a lot cheaper as well to go through this, to use this data source. Okay, so for the cameras, we've worked with several students and volunteers to go through these videos, and we now have data from the nestling period for 13 boxes. And for the nest box contents, we've gone through 48 boxes with just two students. So it's a lot faster to go through the data from the nest box contents. And here's a video with showing just the kind of footage that we're getting. And so that is a skink that this female who has the GPS transmitter has brought to her nestlings. Just as a reminder from the literature, we see mostly insects followed by mammals, birds, and reptiles. And now here are our data. These are deliveries. These are the number of items that are brought to the nest box. This is based on the camera data. And so we see that insects are still the most important, but the mammals are a bigger chunk of the prey deliveries in our study area than in North America overall, based on the previous studies. We also see that reptiles and amphibians, which are dominated by skinks, are much more important in our area than they are in North America overall. And now to dive into the camera results in more detail, here we're looking at one nest box and we're looking at the proportion of prey deliveries. We see that this nest box was about half insects shown in green and about half mammals shown in brown. Then we look at another nest box. We see that again, about half the prey that were delivered were insects, and the other half in this case were skinks. So we see a big difference between these two nest boxes. And then when we plot all 13 nest boxes, we see, first of all, a lot of variation. So some of them are mostly mammals in terms of number of prey delivered. Some are mostly insects, and a couple have significant numbers of skinks and birds. And this is based on 3,685 prey deliveries that were identified. Now let's look at biomass. So here we are taking an average value of the weight of each of these prey categories and multiplying that by the number of deliveries. And that gives us the estimated biomass that's being brought back to the box. So this is the weight of prey by category. And this is what we really care about. So this is what really matters in terms of, bringing calories to the babies. And we see that when we do this calculation, that mammals are by far the most important contributor to the diet of kestrels in our area. But we also still see a lot of variation. And so, for example, in box number 2 there, it's still mostly skinks that are providing the calories to the babies. And we see significant contributions from birds as well when we calculate biomass. Turning to nest box contents, these are some photos of the kind of things we find in the box. The top image is showing mostly beetle legs with a couple grasshopper legs, and the bottom is showing cicada wings and grasshopper wings. And we find a lot of different insects, but they're dominated by June bugs, as well as Carolina grasshoppers, some cicadas, and a lot of dung beetles and carrion beetles, like rainbow scarab, American carrion beetle, and sexton beetles. And we were a bit surprised to see the dung beetles and carrion beetles. It seems that the kestrels are hunting these beetles off of cow pies and off of carcasses. And we also suspect that some of the dung beetles are going into the nest box because it's so disgusting in there. And then the babies eat them when they go in there. We found the remains of these three different kinds of small mammals, meadow voles, short-tailed shrews, and chipmunks in the nest box. And one thing we were interested in was trying to figure out if voles or shrews were more important as prey items for kestrels. In the videos, we have pretty high resolution videos, but you cannot always tell if it's a meadow vole or a shrew. They both have short tails. They're both little furry mammals. Um, but we think, based on the cameras, that it's mostly voles and not that many shrews. But it's easy to tell when you have the skulls and the teeth. And so based on that and the nest box contents, we found that indeed there are many more voles than shrews in the nest box contents. For birds, we found cardinals, bluebirds, catbirds, goldfinches, and song sparrows. And now to do a comparison, looking at the same six boxes, we're going to look at both data sources. So here we have the nest box contents, and it's dominated by insects in terms of prey deliveries. But then when we look at the camera data for those same six nest boxes, we see a big difference. And we see that most of the deliveries recorded on the cameras were mammals as opposed to insects, and quite a few other invertebrates as well, such as crayfish. And so this is interesting. And so this is showing us that the nest box contents data are biased towards insects. Yes, they're bringing in insects, but they're also bringing in a lot of mammals, more mammals than insects. Um, and so what's happening is that there are undigested insect parts left in the box. That's what we're getting from the contents. But apparently most of the mammals are being consumed and not leaving much evidence in the contents. So to summarize diet, mammals, most of which are meadow insects, skinks, and birds are all important components of the diet. Mammals are the most important by weight, which is what really matters, and insects by numbers. Camera data provide a more complete picture, and contents are overestimating the number of insects. Luckily, we have two Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation students this semester who are helping us to watch camera footage. It's going to continue to be a big team effort to go through all this footage. And one of our goals is to connect the diet data with movement data and habitat. So we want to see if the habitat within the home range is related to what kinds of prey are being brought back to the box. This is an important thing to understand. That brings me to prey abundance. So it's unclear how prey abundance and accessibility are related to habitat selection in American kestrels. Nobody has studied this in detail. And we're really interested in this. So we want to know where kestrel prey are most abundant. And so we study grasshoppers, dragonflies, and small mammals. And we compare their abundance in different kinds of habitats and also in fields that had different vegetation structure. So there's been one similar study on grasshoppers and vegetation structure in our area. This is from Dulles Airport. And here on the y-axis is the grasshopper abundance, and on the x is the vegetation height. And so this study found many more grasshoppers in short vegetation. And I looked, but didn't find any studies that looked at grassland type or vegetation structure and related those to the abundance of dragonflies. Dragonflies are aquatic animals, and most people are focused on studying them around their breeding habitat. So this is new information that we're getting on the effect of habitat type and vegetation structure on dragonfly abundance. And I want to take a little more time to talk about meadow voles because meadow voles are the squid of the grassland. A big part of their job in life is to be food for other things, just like squid are. They are chunky. They're bigger than other small mammals in our area, so they're good prey. They have a lot of noisy arguments, and so they're easy to detect. They don't hibernate, so they're available in the winter. They're active in day and night, so good for hawks and for owls. They're usually pretty common, so 60 voles per acre. And that same study from near Dulles Airport, they found that 92% of small mammals that were caught in grasslands in our area were meadow voles. So they're the dominant small mammal in kestrel habitat. But there have been no detailed studies of prey abundance and kestrel habitat selection in North America. So for the closest, well, the only really comparable study comes from Switzerland. And these folks in Switzerland, they studied wildflower strips that were planted next to agricultural fields. And they estimated prey abundance, and they also watched raptors hunt there. And they found that voles, not meadow voles, but another species of vole, which is pretty similar, voles were most abundant in tall and dense vegetation. In contrast, the raptors were found hunting in the short vegetation, and they were seen hunting along the edges of the tall vegetation. So common kestrels and long-eared owls is what they studied. And so what these authors concluded is that the tall vegetation was probably serving as a source of prey. And the prey were spilling over from the tall vegetation into the short grass where they could be either detected or caught by the raptors. So this is super interesting, and we wanted to see if this was the case here in Virginia. So we measured the abundance of grasshoppers and dragonflies by walking 100-meter long transects. And along those transects, we counted insects on both sides out to 5 meters. And we measured the vegetation structure at 3 sites along the transect. For mammals, we used track pads, which are sections of vinyl rain gutter that have been cut in half with a piece of paper in the middle, 2 ink pads on the end, and a ball of sunflower butter and oats in the middle to serve as bait. We then close these up, and so the voles are encouraged to go in there and get after the bait. And we recorded a presence or absence. If there were a lot of footprints, then that is a presence. Here you can, if you look close, you can see a lot of cute little footprints of some meadow voles. And here's Maggie Grady doing the hard work of making a whole bunch of bait balls for this project. So in 2024, we doubled the size of our arrays to increase our sample. And so we set up arrays of 24 track pads. Those are shown by the black squares. And these covered almost a half acre at each site that we studied. And you can see that we sampled the vegetation structure at those red dots at 4 sites within the array. We ran these track pads for 5 days, and we checked them every 24 hours. And we have a huge sample of kestrel prey abundance. So we did this at 56 sites, or 56 fields, and at each field, we sampled them 3 times from April to September. And here are the results. So for number of grasshoppers, we see that there's no difference between grasshopper abundance in hay, meadow, and pasture. But we do find more dragonflies in meadows than in hayfields or pastures. But we didn't find any effect of vegetation structure, vegetation height, or vegetation density on grasshopper abundance, nor do we find an effect of vegetation height or vegetation density on dragonfly abundance. And here are the results for small mammals. So on the y-axis is the proportion of track pads with footprints. And on the X, we have the 3 habitat types. And we see that meadows had many more voles than hayfields or pastures. And this is really exciting. So this is, as we know now from our other work, that meadow voles is the most important prey item for kestrel nestlings. And so this is a strong indication that meadows are providing that food source. And then to look at vegetation structure, here on the y-axis is again is vole abundance, and on the x is vegetation height. And we see a highly significant relationship where there are more voles in taller vegetation. We also see there aren't very many zeros here, so most of the samples in meadows had at least a few voles. And then in contrast, when we look at hay, we still see a significant positive relationship. So the taller the hay fields are, the more voles, but we see a lot of zeros. So it's not as good as meadows. And with pastures, very similar to hay. So when we combine all three, overall, there's a clear effect where the taller the vegetation is, the more voles. And if you remember from our vegetation structure results that I presented early on, kestrels rarely hunt in our area, at least, in fields that are taller than a foot tall. And so most of this prey is out of reach for these kestrels. So to summarize prey abundance, kestrels select fields with short and open vegetation, but their most important prey, meadow require the opposite conditions. And we conclude that kestrels are probably hunting along edges of tall vegetation, just like common kestrels and long-eared owls in Switzerland. But unfortunately, our tracking technology doesn't allow us to prove that. We need a bigger bird that can carry a transmitter that can record more frequently. And we are hoping that our collaborative work with Virginia Working Landscapes on barn owls will allow us to do that. But we have enough information now to recommend that folks leave tall, unmowed strips along the edges of agricultural fields. This will serve as a food source for raptors, and it'll also provide pollinator habitat. And another option is mowing wide trails through meadows. The big caveat there is that you want to mow as little as possible during the growing season to avoid killing grassland birds, box turtles, and everything else. That brings me to fledgling survival. So here's a cute bird that is almost a fledgling. This is a nestling. It's going to leave the nest box in a couple days. And so it looks pretty vulnerable to me. And the fledgling period has always been thought of as a risky time, especially when they first become independent. And these young birds are not very good at hunting. They're hunting mostly insects. They don't really know how to hunt voles yet. Um, and they're thought to be really vulnerable to predators. So one of the hypotheses for the decline has been low fledgling survival. And there's been one good study of this. It was from Connecticut, and they tracked 11 fledglings with radio tags, and they found that 7 of those fledglings died before migration. So most of them died. And so this supported the hypothesis that fledgling survival could be contributing to the decline. But Hawk Mountain, our colleagues at Hawk Mountain launched a project to track a lot more fledglings to see if this was really the case with a bigger sample. And they ended up getting 146 fledglings that were tagged with radio tags. And 20 of those fledglings were ours from Virginia. And you can see there were 3 study sites in Pennsylvania and 1 in New Jersey that all contributed to this study. And here's a cute fledgling, well, about to be a fledgling with a radio tag. This is what they look like. And unlike the Connecticut study, we found 94 to 100% survival, depending on the study site. And none of our 20 birds in Virginia died. So this contradicts the results from the Connecticut study and suggests that low fledgling survival may not be such a big deal in the Northeast after all. And these results were published just this year, earlier this year, in the Journal of Raptor Research. That brings me to the last research section of this talk, and that's about migration. So this is the Hawk Watch at Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania, and folks have been gathering at places like these in the fall for decades to count the raptors migrating past. This has generated an important data set on the number of raptors that pass by and when. Also, the sexes can be distinguished for kestrels, so you get data on when the males and females are going through. But of course, you're getting no information on individual migration routes. And the other thing is that these hawk watches are mostly in the mountains or along the coast, and so we're not getting data on the Piedmont. But what we have learned so far is that birds that breed in more northern locations tend to be more migratory than southern birds. And here in Virginia, about halfway down the continent, about half of our birds we think are migratory. And a couple of studies out west have shown that birds are more likely to migrate in colder winters, and also smaller bodied birds are more likely to migrate. And there's an old observational study from Florida where some folks waited for the kestrels to arrive every winter, and they concluded that kestrels were pretty well synchronized, and they all tended to show up at about the same time in the Panhandle of Florida. But there's actually only one study that has looked at the detailed migration routes of American kestrels. And this is partially because, like I said, the GPS tracking technology has only recently become available. But light level geolocators have been around for a while, but this was the only study that I could find that used them to track kestrel migration. And so they ended up getting data from 4 satellite tags and 6 geolocators. And this is what they found. So the really amazing thing is this route that goes from Alberta to Nicaragua. That's a really long trip for such a small bird. It's amazing to see that here. We also see a bird from Oregon and one from Idaho, both of which went down to New Mexico. We see one from Michigan to Texas. Um, so we're starting to get a little bit of information here on migration routes, which is cool. And now turning to our data, and this is up till 2024. This doesn't even include the data from this year, which we have a lot more that we've added now to this. We see here that we have a lot more information about the routes. This is not showing the number of locations, but all these routes are backed up by a whole bunch of locations. And so the black circles are showing breeding sites or overwintering sites. The orange routes are showing fall migration paths, whereas the teal routes are showing spring migration paths. And so we can see that our birds are migrating through the Piedmont of Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, and then down into the coastal plain of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Um, we also see that they're not crossing many MODIS towers. Those are the yellow circles. And so birds with MODIS tags are not going to be able, we're not going to pick up their migration routes. So really the way to go currently, if you want to study kestrel migration in our area, is by using GPS transmitters. And so now I'm going to focus on a few of our star birds, Peaches and Dee. So first we have Peaches. We tagged her in May of 2021. And we have, like I said earlier, more than 11,000 locations for her. So just Peaches alone is more data than anyone has collected for kestrels anywhere in the world. And it's really cool. So she has wintered on the same farm in southern Georgia each year. And she's made the trip from Georgia to Virginia in as little as 2 days. And so this is hot off the press. This is all the data we have on Peaches, and so you can see how she goes back and forth from Northern Virginia to Georgia. And if we zoom in on her winter range, we see here the dots are showing different years, and we can see that for all 3 winters, she spent her time in exactly the same area. And so she is hunting in a pasture as well as row crop. Now to Dee. So we tagged her in 2023. And Dee has been particularly interesting because she's left both years in June. And, everything you read about kestrels, June should be breeding season. And so she was done with her nesting attempts and she left and spent the rest of the year in Georgia. So this is the first time anyone has shown this for kestrels, and this revises the description of the annual cycle of kestrels. Pretty amazing. And so she has also wintered in the same farm both winters, and this is in southeastern Georgia. And here's what it looks like. So this winter, she spent 8 months on this farm in Georgia. And pretty cool. So this is obviously not a, natural habitat. These are irrigated row crops. They seem to be Vidalia onions. I'm still trying to pin that down. And I think these are pecan orchards surrounding the row crop fields. And she's sitting on the irrigation structures. So, this is really interesting. And we are just starting to look at this. But obviously, if she's spending most of her year here, we need to figure out how she's doing down there. Are these birds exposed to a lot of pesticides? How are their needs being met on these wintering grounds? So obviously, we're concerned with our habitat up here, and we want to provide good habitat for kestrels and learn how they're doing during the breeding season. But if they're not able to make a living on the wintering grounds in places like this, we need to understand that. The third bird I'll look at is Hazel. So we tagged her last year. She left in July, and she also wintered in Georgia on a different farm in southwestern Georgia. And one thing we noticed about her migration route is that she got off track for a while there in the southern Piedmont of Virginia, but corrected that pretty quickly. And she wintered in a very similar landscape as Dee. So the same comments apply for her. We need to understand what's happening on the wintering grounds for these birds. And, so in addition to habitat on the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds, it's also important that we find out what's happening at stopover sites. And so migratory birds like kestrels rely on stopovers for refueling and to help them make their journeys between the wintering and breeding sites. And here, the bigger circles are showing stopovers of 30 or 40 days, so these kestrels are spending a lot of time at these stopover sites, and we need to investigate what the habitat and the threats are at these sites as well. And we are just starting to do that. So I just took a quick look at some stopovers that Peaches and Hazel were using in South Carolina. You can see Peaches is again on the irrigated row crops, and Hazel can't tell if that's a row crop or a hayfield, but it'll be really cool to dig into this as well. Okay, so to summarize it all, to look at our research questions, the first is how does home range size vary as a function of sex and season? And we find that males have bigger home ranges than females. We also see that home ranges are biggest during the nestling and fledgling periods and during the winter. And we see that male home range size drops when females spend more time feeding the young. Second, we wanted to know how does vegetation structure affect habitat selection? And we found that there's a strong relationship where kestrels are selecting short vegetation. Third, we wanted to know about the diet. And we found that insects are the most commonly delivered prey item, but small mammals are the most important by weight, followed by skinks and birds. Fourth, we wanted to look at prey abundance, and we found that small mammals were the most common. Uh, we found that small mammals were most common in tall and dense vegetation and in meadows, and dragonflies were also most common in meadows. Fifth, we wanted to know if low fledgling survival was responsible for the decline, and that is apparently not the case. And finally, we wanted to know where they spend the winter, and we found they're wintering from Florida to South Carolina on row crops. And we also see that D left in June twice, which revises our understanding of the annual cycle of kestrels. So to review the possible reasons for the decline, we don't have, great answers for all of these. I would say now we're pretty confident that low fledgling survival is not a big issue in the Northeast. But for these others, we are not sure yet. But if I had to guess, I would say loss of agricultural land and urbanization and clean farming are major drivers of the kestrel decline. Insecticides and rodenticides, the jury is still out on that one. We have done some testing and found not very many pesticides in the blood of our kestrels. Predation by Cooper's hawks, that's, not a very popular theory anymore. And competition with starlings probably also playing a role. So I'll finish up with some quick land management recommendations. First of all, we recommend bush hogging fields every year in February, and you can consider mowing some wide trails to help kestrels. Again, you want to be careful during the nesting season or during the growing season. So, you want to do this at the earliest on July 1st and always be careful. You can install and maintain kestrel boxes, and you can ask your neighbors to get involved. You can do the Bruce Jones method and dig a hole and install a dead tree to serve as a perch. That's especially important in fields where there are no power lines or not many trees. And if you have a big property, you can maintain fields of different heights, some for quail and pollinators and shorter areas for grassland birds. And we don't recommend using insecticides or rodenticides. For nest boxes, you can buy a good box from Greg's Wood Duck Boxes, or you can build your own following Art Kingert's design, which is posted on our website. And if you would like to set up a nest box, the fields need to be at least 20 acres in size, the bigger the better. And you want to space the boxes every third of a mile. And you're going to need to buy two by 4 by 12 boards, as well as flashing and harbor cloth. And the instructions on how to do that are at our website. And also feel free to email us to get advice, and we may be able to help you install the boxes. So I'd like to thank the landowners who allowed this research and also major funding from the Rains Family Fund, Band Foundation, and Nick Lapham. Funding also came from Virginia Society of Ornithology, Washington Biologist Field Club, Peregrine Fund, Janine Mosley, and Eldon Farm. Thank you.